Aber Loyalität reicht nicht. Sie müssen den Mann im Hohen Schloss finden.
Ich stecke bereit nach ihm, mein Führer.
Suchen? Suchen Sie ihn nicht, finden Sie ihn und seine Filme auf der Stelle oder alles wird verloren sein. Alles.
Welcome back everyone to yet another one of my The Man in the High Castle videos. Now on this video, I'll be reminding you and jogging your memory when it comes to things that you need to remember out of Season 2 before you head into watching Season 3 of The Man in the High Castle. But before I get down to business, let me remind you that I'm going to be doing a review of the third season of the series a day or two after its release, so just make sure you're subscribed and you have notifications enabled to get notified of that video as soon as it comes online. But with that being said, let's get started with everything you need to remember before the release of the third season of The Man in the High Castle. Number 1. Now you probably remember this one, but the series is based in a world where everything is upside down. Everything, starting from World War II, is kind of different than what we know. In the reality of the show, the Nazis and the Japanese won World War II, and the world is kind of split into three. The Nazi-occupied territories, the Japanese-controlled zones, and the neutral zone. But in the middle of this dystopia, there's a glimpse of hope. And this hope comes from all these films that depict alternate realities. And up until the end of Season 1, we did not know where all these films came from. But then in the final act, we came to see the Japanese Trade Minister Tagomi travel to one of these alternate realities, one that is just like ours and in which the Allies won the war. But the thing about these films that I was just talking about is that they are not really public knowledge, because number 2, these films are basically in the hands of two people worldwide, Hitler and the man we know as the Man in the High Castle. But let's focus on the second one. Now the Man in the High Castle was unknown to us throughout the entirety of Season 1, but come Season 2, we got to find out who he is exactly, and his name is Hawthorne Abendsen. But Abendsen wasn't really the first face we got to see on the second season of the series, because number 3, we started off with Juliana Crane after she's fallen prisoner to the Resistance, and that was all because of the stunts she pulled at the very end of Season 1, allowing Joe Blake to escape with one of the films that the Man in the High Castle wanted. Now after a whole lot of conversations with her captors, Juliana seemingly managed to convince them to allow her to meet with the man running this entire operation, the Man in the High Castle. So she meets him and he shows her this library of films that he has from alternate realities. He explains to her how all of these work and tells her the story about how one man that she sees in one of these films, dying in an alley and in Nazi uniform, would save San Francisco from total destruction.
Each one of these films show a reality like ours, but not ours. You learn an awful lot watching these films.
He then shows her a still of the man. He asks her if she knows him. She tells him that he looks familiar, but that she cannot really remember where she saw him before. However though, not too long after, she does discover that she does know the guy, because number 4, after Juliana manages to escape her captors, she's pretty much on the run from everyone with a gun, the Japanese and the Resistance. She starts off by trying to enlist the help of Tagomi, but she kinda fails, so her last resort is to do something else, something completely unexpected. And realizing she's at this point of no return, she pays a quick visit to her mother. Now visiting her mother, she goes through some family albums and sees that man, George Dixon. The man whom she right away discovers is her sister Trudy's biological father. And knowing that and knowing he's in New York and being surrounded by everyone who wants to get her, she, and once more unexpectedly, walks her way to requesting asylum with the Nazis.
Hands up! She's not
My name is Juliana Crane. I work with Joe Blake. I need asylum.
Number 5. Arriving in New York, Juliana is met by John Smith, who interrogates her at first, tries to find out everything she knows about the Resistance back in San Francisco and the Man in the High Castle. And to gain his trust, she does tell him everything she knows about the Resistance back in San Francisco, yet she did omit the part about the Man in the High Castle and how she did meet him. But after this interrogation, Juliana is given a life in New York by John Smith. She tries to find Joe Blake, but he's nowhere to be found, but then she tries to find George Dixon, and this one she finds. Number 6. So George Dixon, he's basically a ranking member of the Resistance in New York, and since news of the anger of the Resistance back in San Francisco with Juliana has traveled, he kind of makes a deal with her. He would protect her and keep her out of the reach of the Resistance, who have it in for her, in return for information that she has access to, being close to the Smiths and all. Now, while a lot of things that George asks her to do go against her beliefs and moral values, Juliana just decides to go with it in order to find out what happens next. She's just trying all along to figure out what's gonna happen next, find out where all of this is gonna go, and make sure she avoids the disaster she knows is coming San Francisco's way. Number 7. Now, in the meanwhile, and while all of this is happening with Juliana, in parallel we get to see Joe Blake. He's made it back to New York, delivered the film to John Smith, who in turn delivered it to the viewer back in Berlin. And while Joe Blake doesn't want anything else to do with John Smith, there is something bigger at play for him. So Joe ends up being visited by John Smith in his house, who persuades him to leave for Berlin to meet his biological father. Now, after Joe agrees, we see him travel to Berlin, meet up with his father, Martin Heussman, who's pretty much a big shot back there. We get to see a lot of anger from Joe's side towards his father, whom he believes abandoned him when he was a child. However, though we soon realize that Joe was born in a Nazi breeding facility, and that his mother was the one who took him and fled to New York just because she couldn't bear seeing the atrocities that were being committed in Nazi Germany. Now, after coming to this realization, Joe Blake's relationship with his father improves by a whole lot. And going forward, and with the influence this girl Nicole that he met in Germany had on him, along with the influence that his father now had on him, he became the SS officer depicted on the same film that depicted the ruin of San Francisco. Number 8. So Joe Blake's father, Martin Heussman, is the biggest villain of the season. So after the death of Hitler and with the reins of powers in Heussman's hands, he does not believe that the Germans and the Japanese should coexist. The man just wanted to go for the domination of the entire world. Number 9. Now, when speaking of Joe Blake, you cannot really tell the entire story without the story of John Smith. And throughout the second season, Hitler's man in New York, John Smith, was pretty occupied by the ailment of his son Thomas and what it means. And out of his fear that in pursuit of genetic purity, the Nazi doctors would recommend the ending of his son's life, he went to great lengths to stop that, including the murder of Dr. Adler, his son's doctor and the only other person who knows of his situation, and one who threatened to inform the authorities about it all. Number 10 though. Now, after his first visit to that alternate reality at the end of the first season, Trade Minister Tagomi kinda became addicted to those kind of visits. And on that side of reality, he had a family that's been abandoned by his alternate version. Now, that family included a wife, a son, a grandson, and a daughter-in-law who happened to be an alternate version of Juliana Crane. And while the man struggled with the loss of his wife in his core reality, he did struggle as well in this reality with the concept of having a family. And with their lack of knowledge that he's not the same man who abandoned them in the past, they also did find it pretty hard to adjust. But over time, that was kind of sorted out. Only the problem is Tagomi could not stay forever in this reality. Number 11. So once his activist son and his activist daughter-in-law get their hands on a film of the American government testing a hydrogen bomb, Tagomi decides to take it back to his world and try to use it to stop the impending war, and he entrusts Juliana in helping him sneak it out, which she does. Tagomi then returns back to his reality and reveals to his assistant Kodomichi that he has known all along that he came from that world where the Japanese lost the war and were hit with the atomic bomb. But number 12. Now, before we get to connect the dots on the ending of Season 2, we need to talk about Frink. Now, as you all probably remember, Frink was Juliana's boyfriend on Season 1 of the series. And at the very end of the first season, Ed McCarthy, his best friend, was kind of wrongfully accused by the Japanese for the assassination attempt on the life of the Japanese crown prince. And the second season saw Frink trying to get Ed out of his imprisonment by the Japanese. He tried to turn himself into Inspector Kido of the Kempeitai to replace Ed, but Kido turned him down. And when it seemed that all hope has been lost, he enlisted the help of the antiques dealer, Childen. And through a series of events that were triggered by that very moment, he ended up working for the Yakuza. But he had one condition to be able to work for them: help him get his partner in forgery out of prison. And that partner is Ed McCarthy. Alright, so together, Ed, Frink, and Childen worked for the head of the Yakuza. But that was only up until the point where the man was gunned down by the Kempeitai, with Kido under the impression he's a traitor working for the Nazis. But that was not really all there was to Frink on the second season, because number 13, after being played by the Resistance into believing that Juliana left to New York to end up with Joe Blake, Frink ends up joining the Resistance himself. Now he slowly develops a relationship with the Japanese-American Sarah, who also works with the Resistance. And while it seemed kind of weird in the beginning that a Japanese is resisting the Japanese, Sarah, even though Japanese, grew up in an American concentration camp when she first immigrated to the US. But that was before the Japanese occupation came knocking at the door, deeming her and her family unworthy because of their original act of immigration. Number 14. Now last we saw Frank and Sarah, they were on a mission to stop the A-bomb, one that General Onoda was building. And so they ended up blowing the Kempeitai headquarters where Onoda happened to be. Now whether or not Frank and Sarah survived the explosion has not been confirmed by the end of the second season, but it is more probable than not that they did die. But that being said, let's connect all the dots for the entire season. Number 1. Now last we left Juliana on this recap, she was basically helping George Dixon with any information she could get on the Smiths or from the Smiths. However though, and at some point down the road, Dixon comes to know of the ailment of Thomas Smith, and at that point he decides it would be a good blow to John Smith if his superiors were to realize he's harboring such a secret. Now Juliana does try to plead with him and stop him from uncovering the secret on the premise that Thomas has no fault in all of this, and that he's not party to the conflict and the beef that the Resistance kinda has with Smith. But when all her pleas end up in failure, she ends up shooting him dead in an alley and while he's in Nazi uniform. Number 2. So Tagomi makes it back from the alternate reality. In the Japanese Pacific states, he visits Kido, gives him the film that he got from the alternate reality, and Kido in return takes it to John Smith in New York, who uses it in Berlin to stop the war. Now John Smith, who was not supposed to leave New York, enlists the help of Joe Blake as soon as he arrives at Berlin to be able to get close to the war room without getting arrested. And once he gets there, he convinces everyone that this war should not happen based on the fact that the Japanese are the ones currently testing the hydrogen bomb. And using other information that he's obtained so far, he reveals to Himmler that Heussman was behind the death of the Führer. That, and in turn, leads to the arrest of Heussman and his son Joe Blake. Number 3. Now watching his father glorified on TV as a Nazi hero, Thomas decides to give himself up to Nazi doctors, leaving his mother Helen stricken with grief. And as of the end of the second season, John Smith has no idea how things have unfolded for his son back in New York. Number 4. Now before I get to talk about Juliana's final scenes on the second season, let's talk a quick explainer of how everything worked out so smoothly at the end of season 2. So if Tagomi were not to travel to that alternate reality, he wouldn't have gotten his hands on that film. And if he weren't to go back and give it to Kido, Kido wouldn't have taken it to John Smith, who in return took it to Germany and saved the day. Now if Juliana weren't to kill George Dixon, he would have told on John Smith, and that would have prevented him from traveling to Berlin and stopping the war. And if Joe Blake weren't to travel to Berlin in the first place and become this piece of clay in the hands of both his father and Nicole, shaping him the way they like, John Smith wouldn't have been able to get to the war room where he managed to stop said war. Even Frank's possible death in the Kempeitai headquarters kind of played a role in all of this, changing the future from one in which he would have been shot by Joe Blake to one in which he died by choice and before that event. But at the very end of the finale, number 5, Abendsen reveals to Juliana the details of his plan and how she was always the common denominator in all the films he's watched so far. He tells her of how everyone kinda changes with every reality, but she never did. Her true and good nature was always one and the same.
Some of the people you knew, I started seeing them too, revolving around you like an atom. But they would change, different behavior, different relationships, different points of view shaped by their lives. But you were always you. You and your unnatural, consistent mind.
And finally he informs her that's what led her to killing George Dixon in order to save Thomas, and how Thomas had to be saved in order for John to live, and how John had to live in order for San Francisco to stand tall. But that was just the beginning of the final sequence of the season, because number 6, on the very final scene of the second season, he walks her to meet her sister Trudy, And this Trudy pretty much represented the cliffhanger of the second season, with us not knowing if she was the Trudy from a different reality, or if somehow the Trudy from the core reality of the series was not the one that has been shot to start with. But that, however, guys, brings our recap to an end. So let me know in the comments if I've missed any key highlights that should have been included as part of this recap. And while doing so, remember that I cannot fit every single detail in a recap, otherwise it wouldn't be really a recap. So key highlights please. But let me know as well if you did like this video by dropping it a much appreciated like, and if that were to be the case and you did like it, remember as well it would be much appreciated if you subscribe and enable notifications for my future videos. Now you could find as well links to my Discord server, Facebook page and Twitter handle in the description down below and on the end screen to this video. So if you ever want to drop by and have a discussion over The Man in the High Castle, feel free to do it anytime. Let's just spark a conversation. Until I see you next time though, thank you all for tuning in and have a great day.